Excellent. So welcome. Tonight we're touring Spain. And many of us have toured Spain together before, but it's always an important country to come back to. One of the things that's so wonderful about Spain is that it is constantly changing in the wine world right now. Really, it's one of those areas, those countries, those regions where as soon as it's in print, it's out of date, because this is just such an exciting place for producers to hone in on their craft. And really, we begin creating these new laws around the quality that's already been established in specific regions and by producers. So we'll talk quite a bit about that tonight. I have a lot to share with you. The presentation that we have is a wonderful presentation that was put together by Ryan. It is very, it's quite dense and it's very concise, but we only have an hour. I want to be respectful of your time. I know we have dinner to get to and family to spend time with. So we'll move pretty quickly. Please don't hesitate to stop me if I can clarify or answer any questions, and we won't cover probably everything on each one of the slides just to be respectful of time, but I'll certainly, as always, send out the recording as well as a copy of the slides later on. And please always, of course, reach out to us because you know, community, our wine community is one of the best things that has come out of the events of 2020, right? So welcome. Hi, Venkat. So nice to have you on here.
Hey,
Okay.
Amber. Likewise. Nice to be on.
Yeah, I'm so happy you're here. Okay, so let's get started, right? So I'm assuming everybody can see me here. We've been doing a few less virtual classes over the summer. And so it's kind of crazy to me, like how you almost kind of like forget to use Zoom. There was a period that we were using it so often, and now it's not quite as much, which is a great thing. But sorry if I take a few moments to get myself settled and situated here. So we're touring Spain today. As I was just mentioning, the laws are changing almost as quickly as the days and the calendar changing. It's one of the most exciting areas for the production of wine for small independent producers, family-owned wineries. They really, you know, believe in a lot of the indigenous varieties that are found within these regions. They really follow a lot of the tradition of winemaking in the different areas of Spain. There's a fierce national and local pride for a lot of the producers in the wine regions that we do have here as well. And it's really an exciting time because one of the other best things about this is that the wines are still inexpensive. And so they still are great value for us. The quality of what you're getting in Spain versus other more established countries in Europe for the price is astronomical. So we always, of course, want to do two things when it comes to wine. One is that we want you to have an opportunity to know and try the classic established producers of Spain, but then we also always want to share who are the kind of up and comers, maybe the smaller producers that we don't hear about as much, that we want to support with our money and with our dollar, right? So we have two wines coming from our friend at Ledoux Wine Shops today. So the first one is the César Márquez. So this is the Parajes Godello 2019 coming from Bierzo. So we will get to talking about these regions, so we won't go too far into the areas just yet. But César Márquez has very deep roots in Bierzo. His family founded their first winery, Castro Venosa, in 1752. He's the nephew of a very famous winemaker in Bierzo, and in Rías Baixas. He also makes Albarino, named Raúl Pérez. He started his own solo project in 2015. So Why are these wines so cool? Why do we want to share them? Well, one of the reasons is in the New York wine community, Raul Perez is a really big deal. He is a larger than life character. And if you go to like any of the tastings that he comes to in New York City, so his wines are brought in by a really big importer named Skurnik, who is a great importer and distributor of very, very fantastic high quality wines. And so Raul will usually come to the Skurnik portfolio tasting that they do every year, and his table is always just mobbed by New York sommeliers. It's like you can hardly even get in there to get a taste of anything because everybody wants to meet him, everybody wants to taste his wine. But a lot of people aren't familiar that his nephew, who trained under him, is also making his own wine. So in a very kind of like similar style in terms of the philosophy. So its philosophy is working with old vines. He makes 7 different wines right now, and it's following the structure of the new classification of Bierzo. So essentially, many of the wine regions of Spain are turning to a more Burgundian model of classifying their appellations. So sort of a regional wine, village wines, and then single vineyard wines. It's a really exciting thing. The wines of Spain are very terroir driven, and I think oftentimes we don't think of the Spanish wines that way, but I hope that after this class we'll begin to. Parajes is the appellation wine. This is 100% Godello. It is organic. It's hand harvested. These vines are up to 100 years old. It takes place fermentation in neutral barrels. It's aged in used oak for 11 months. It's a little bit of a reductive style. So you might have a little bit of like smokiness, kind of flintiness to the wine. It's not made to be a really rich, creamy style, although there is some of that there. Sometimes we like to say that Godello from Bierzo drinks a little bit like Chablis. It's a somewhat neutral grape variety. It doesn't have like really floral or herbaceous or really bold fruit aroma to it. But it has a beautiful acidity, lovely minerality, and a little bit of a textural element to the palate that can be really nice. And one of our personal favorites, and we'll get to talking more about Bierzo too. For a classic, so César Márquez, a very kind of newly established, up and coming, lesser known producer. We couldn't have gone more in the opposite direction with our red wine today, the Condado de Haza. So this is a Crianza style Tempranillo. If you do have this bottle, so this actually is an older label. But I do think it's just the more recognizable label of the brand. It's a little bit, it's similar now, but the picture of the castle is a little bit more faded. I think this is actually the winery, but a little bit more faded on the label. It's not such a focal point, but you still have the same wine here, just a new look. So Alejandro Fernandez and his wife, Esperanza Ribera, they started off in the 1970s, and they brought a 16th stone winery, and they released their first wine, Tinto Pesquera, in 1975. Along with a few other producers, they are known as some of the pioneers of Ribera del Duero. In 1975, there was Vega Sicilia, who's one of the most well-known, the most established wineries of the region. But that was almost it. There was a couple of there were other grape growers and other producers in the region, of course, but none that were nearly established commercially as something like Vega Sicilia. And we just skyrocketed post 1975 because of producers like Pesquera and producers like Peter Sisek coming from Pingus and others that really brought a lot of attention to this region and a lot of innovation as well. So they're known as some of the pioneers. Petrus, what was once called by Robert Parker, the Petrus of Spain. So at a time when people really looked to Robert Parker's reviews, and he reviewed the Pesquera wines very, very favorably. And so they really kind of turned toward these wines. This property, kind of not necessarily like a second label, it's like another second property. Condado de Haza was added in 1988. It is 100 hectares of Tempranillo. There are no other grapes that go into the Condado de Haza, the 100% Tempranillo. That is more common in Ribera del Duero than in Rioja. So you can have 100% Tempranillo in Rioja, of course. In Ribera del Duero, it's quite common for the wine to be 100% Tempranillo, but you can still blend in some of those other ancillary grape varieties. It's still family run today by Alejandro and Esperanza's 4 granddaughters. For this property, the vines are an average of 30 years old and aging, of course, and it's aged in both French and American oak, which is also quite common for a lot of these Spanish wine regions we'll discuss. Then it spends 6 months in bottle before being released. It has a really beautiful kind of Bordeaux-esque nose to it, blackberries and currant and plum. There's some licorice and coffee. You get a little vanilla from the oak aging. They are very complex wines and they're wonderfully priced for the quality of what you're getting for both of these wines. I mean, if you were to pay, I said, you know, this is kind of like, we say it's like the Chablis of Spain, right? If you were going to pay for a bottle of Chablis of this quality, it would be probably like, you know, $60, $70, $80. If you were to pay for a bottle of Bordeaux of this quality, we'd be thinking probably around $100. And I think, I can't remember, I should have written down the prices of these wines in the retail shop, but you know, they're around like $30, $40 or something like that. So really the quality again of what you're getting for the price is fantastic. Let's keep going. So we'll talk about the background and history, of course, my favorite. We'll talk about the geography and climate. Understanding the climate and the geography will help us go a long way to understanding if we prefer specific styles of wine, meaning higher acidity, lower acidity, fuller bodied, more or less fruit flavors. Understanding the climate and how Spain is affected. It will help us go a long way in selecting wine, even if we don't necessarily know the region that well or the producer that well. We'll talk about, of course, Spanish culture, wine laws. We're going to talk about, I'm just going to pause real fast. I just got a, like a little notification on my screen saying like, you can now see my presentation. Can everybody see it? And could you see it before or no? It looks like, okay.
I can see it.
Okay, great. Okay, perfect. Thank you. I just wanted to just checking in. Talk about Spanish culture and wine laws, cover that, and the most classic regions. So we're going to discuss Green Spain, this area that sits just above Portugal. Primarily, we'll be talking about Rías Baixas. We'll talk about Rioja, of course, one of the most classic areas in Spain. We'll talk about the collective regions in Castilla y León, Ribera del Duero. We'll talk about Cigales, Toro, Rueda. We'll talk about Catalonia. So we have in Catalonia, this is the heartland of cava production, although it can be made in many different areas within Spain, but the heartland is in Pinedas. We also see some of the best reds of Spain come out of this region, bold, luscious, complex, concentrated reds of Priorat. We'll talk about Castilla-La Mancha, a large, very arid, desert-like area. We'll talk about the Levant coast over here. Of course, Andalusia, sherry production. We'll spend a little bit of time on fortified wine, and then we'll skip over to the island. So here we have the island of the Canary Islands that you can see here that are actually located off the coast of Morocco. This is not a correct map. That's not where they belong in relation to Spain, but so that we can fit them on the map, we have them there. And then we have the island of Majorca as well. All right, so we have I'm going to really try to keep my history of Spain brief. I've said before that if you like the the kind of like a medieval style history, you will love the history of Spain. If you like TV shows like Game of Thrones and the Tudors and historical drama fights takeover shows or movies, you would just enjoy reading the history of Spain because it's very contentious. A lot of things have happened on this peninsula. It's just a crossroads of different cultures, and many places in Europe are, but Spain really especially. We do know that vines have been here since 3000 BC. The Phoenicians founded the first city that we know, Gadir, modern day Cadiz in the south, around 1100 BC. They really established the value of viticulture. Wine making, grape growing was very important to the Phoenician culture. They spread vines around the Mediterranean. There were stints back and forth. The Romans were here. We talk about all of these kind of like old Roman terraces in places like France, right? Well, they're also in Spain. So you go to places like, I mean, even in the green Spain, the kind of like northwest corner, the Romans were there. They were building terraces. You can still see the vestiges of these terraces that have been maintained in places like Ribeiro and Ribera Sacra. It's really quite impressive. The Visigoths, the Moors, had a huge influence on Spain. I should have reviewed, like, it's so funny because like I always like review different things for classes, and I kind of forgot to like look over the Moorish history of Spain. But essentially the Moors ruled Spain for more than 700 years, and they actually brought a lot of really great things to the peninsula. A lot of things that we consider to be very like quintessentially Spanish were brought here by the Moors, and that includes things like, I mean, saffron was brought here by the Moors, oranges were brought here, Sophia oranges were brought here by the Moors, rice for paella, all of these things were brought by the Moors, right? And they really established in Europe a lot of universities, libraries. They were a very enlightened culture during this time when most of Europe was kind of in the dark ages. Most of Europe, more than 90% of Europe at the time of Christian Europe, was illiterate, but the Moors really valued education. They valued higher thinking. They valued reading, and they left some of the most striking architecture, especially in places like the south of Spain. The Moorish influence didn't really extend that far into the northern part of Spain. Most of the influence was felt in the south. So cities like in like Andalusia area, cities like Sevilla. Again, I should have looked at my Spanish cities down there again, but I forget what those are, like three. They're like Sevilla, and then the one where the mosquito is, and then somebody might know, and then the other city, I can't remember the names of them, but they have these really beautiful like castles and homes and churches and universities that they built during this time. In the north, we saw far more of the Catholic monarchs. And we start to see a period in Spain where the Moors are trying to move forward and the Catholic monarchs are trying to move southward. The most powerful union happened in 1469 with the marriage of Isabel of Castile I and Ferdinand II of Aragon. And this created one of the most important relationships and kingdom that we found in Spain. So Isabel and Ferdinand ruled for quite some time. They began to push further south into more Moorish territory and take more of Spain back for the Catholic monarchy. They hired a young Italian sailor by the name of Christopher Columbus, and they give him ships and money to sail to the New World. And Columbus opens up a lot of trade. He brings back a lot of kind of New World vegetable things like chocolate, coffee, tobacco, tomatoes, all of these things because of Christopher Columbus came from the New World back to Europe, to what we would consider the Old World, right? He sent high alcohol fortified wines were very popular during this time. We think that probably the very first wine to be imported into the United States was probably sherry, coming from the south of Spain. And Columbus took off from the south of Spain as well. Well, maybe we'll look at that on a map a little bit later. In the late 1800s, champagne method wines take hold in Parajes. So Parajes is in the northeastern part of the country, just outside of Barcelona. There's a young winemaker whose family makes white still wines in the area of Parajes, and he's traveling in other other countries in Europe trying to sell his family's wine. And he comes to the region of Champagne, and he's really impressed by the Champenois method of making sparkling wine with a second fermentation in the bottle. And he brings this technique back to Spain with him. He makes some of the very first traditional method sparkling wine out of the local grapes of the Parajes area. And these wines become known eventually as cava, of course. Phylloxera hits Bordeaux. The root louse just screws up everything. It comes in, it kills all of these vines, these vineyards are dying. The French don't know what to do. They start to look to Spain just over the border, particularly to places like Rioja, and they begin coming to Spain and making wine. Now, this brings a lot of French influence to the areas that are just over the Pyrenees in Spain, especially areas like Rioja, where we still today see the Bordelais influence of aging wines in barrels for an extended period of time. The DO system starts in Spain in 1926. This predates the system that we have in place in France, and it starts in Rioja, becomes the first DO. The Spanish Civil War starts, I think it starts in 1936 to 1939. And after 1939, Franco becomes the dictator, becomes to reign over all of Spain. So under his reign, conditions for growing grapes and making wine were not very favorable. Franco did not want people to drink alcohol. He really tried to take away a lot of the local pride of the individual areas of Spain, especially the Basque people in the northern region of Spain were very repressed under this regime. Franco died in 1975, and Spain is restored to a democracy. So they joined the EU in 1986, and this is really one of the catalysts that starts bringing a lot of outside investment and money, especially into the wine regions of Spain. After the death of Franco, there are essentially 17 autonomous regions that are authorized within Spain, and most of these do correspond with what we know of these kind of wine growing regions like La Rioja and Rioja, Galicia, we'll talk about País Vasco, different places like that. We see a lot of international rediscovery of Spanish wine, a huge bump in quality in vineyards and winemaking. And one of the wonderful things is, we already had established vineyards and established traditions. So we just got the fund to really have proper management and upkeep of these wineries, of these vineyards. We really see a huge mix today of experimental, modern, and traditional technique. Yes, the big, bold Spanish wines are still out there, but we see a lot more of these terroir-driven styles, smaller producers using traditional and native Spanish grapes. And some of these traditional native Spanish grapes we think of as French, and we know they're used in other places as well. But then there's also, wonderful things like Rabi Belza, Rabi Zuri, Albarino, even though we have Albarino in Portugal as well, but Albarino, Mencia, a wonderful local grape, the grapes of the Canary Islands or of Majorca. So we have a lot to talk about. So we're located on the Iberian Peninsula, the world's largest vineyard. 2.9 million acres are planted. There are considered to be more than 625 grape varieties that are planted in Spain. We have a very, very diverse topography. The Pyrenees in the north, we're almost to Africa. Here in the south, you have this very small, just Strait of Gibraltar. The Canary Islands that are located technically somewhere over here, right, way over here in the Atlantic, more than 600 miles from mainland Spain. They're located closer to the coast of Africa, Morocco, than they are to Spain itself. We have a lot of topographical features that make viticulture and agriculture as well, agriculture too. I mean, the food in Spain is incredible, that make it viable, that make us be able to grow these grapes and these different crops. There are rivers, there are mountains, there are oceans, there are valleys, there are flatlands, and there is a large plateau. So this gives us really high altitude, even when we think of Spain as a traditionally very warm climate. As we move to the center, that climate does become more extreme. One, you're on a plateau known as the meseta, but you're also moving away from the cooling influence of the coastal areas of Spain. So we just always kind of think about this idea of this large, hot, flat plateau in the center, and the more kind of like air-conditioned, cooler areas closer to the coast. Drought is a big problem in Spain. Since 2003, irrigation has been allowed, oftentimes on a case-by-case basis. You know, I think a lot of people, when they were first learning about wine, always thought of the European wine regions as never being able to irrigate. And that is changing. And a lot of people do ask too about, you know, well, how is climate change affecting Spain? It is, but they're more uniquely suited to be adaptable to climate change, because in Spain, more or less, it's always been hot. And so they very traditionally, and because they have such a long 3,000 years, right, of like established viticulture in Spain, they've already, you know, really more or less planted the grape varieties that do well in warmer, more arid climates. So these are, of course, like what we consider the kind of Rhone grape varieties, Garnacha, Mourvedre, you know, Carignan, Carignana in Spain. We have all of these traditional grape varieties, but then also some of these the kind of bolder red grapes as well. And we see a lot of white production. Usually it does take place closer to coast and at higher altitudes. Spain is fun. So the quality system started in 1926 with Rioja, Jerez, and then Malaga. It is controlled by the Consejo Regulador, which is the system that oversees all of the different wine growing regions of Spain and their individual laws. So we've talked about this many times before. The individual regions all have their own set of laws governing what grapes they can grow, where they can plant, how they have to grow the grapes, and how they can make the wine, right? Things like aging in oak. They do have that very long history in Spain of aging the wines at the property, and oftentimes required to be aged in some type of oak barrel as well. So most of the wines of Spain fall under the DO, Denomination de Origin. This is the most common. There are two very top tier quality DOCAs in Spain. One is Rioja, the first one that was established in 1991, a region of exceptional quality. And the second, established in 2009, was Priorat. In Priorat, it's known as the DOQ, that is the Catalan term for the DOCA. So the DOCA is Rioja, the DOQ is Priorat. They mean the exact same thing. They're the highest designation that can be given to a wine growing area within Spain. Most of the regions, as I mentioned, fall under the DO. We also have a system of vinos de pagos. I don't think this is updated. I'm sorry, I think they're like 22 or 23 now. I just caught that. I don't think this is updated. My apologies. The vinos de pago are classified wineries, essentially. Sometimes I like to say that they're similar in a way to the classified gross of Bordeaux, where it's the actual winery and winery name itself. And in Spain, that does include the vineyards that is classified. And these are wineries of such extreme renown and history of high quality winemaking that they've been awarded their own appellation status, and they've set their own laws regarding that are regulated still by the Consejo Regulador regarding, again, what grape variety they can plant, how they can make their wines, how long they have to be aged, whether they're aged in oak, and so forth. So oftentimes the vinos de pagos are estates that have traditionally already been outside of the major wine growing regions of Spain and didn't fall into a more restricted appellation or area of origin, if that makes sense. So we do have a relatively new stepping stone, the VC. It's a stepping stone between VT, which is essentially like the IGT kind of style, or IGP that you would find in places like Italy or France. This is a stepping stone you can apply after you've proven yourself during a certain number of time, a certain amount of time, usually 5 to 10 years. You can apply to essentially go up the next step on the quality ladder, if that makes sense. At the very top of the pyramid here, you can see these are the most, these wines have the most restrictions around how you have to grow the grapes and make the wine. And at the bottom, we have the least restrictions. So this is where you would see oftentimes the Vino de Mesa, a lot more like Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, things like Pinot Noir, more international grape varieties. You might see things like Cabernet in the Vino de Pagos, because again, they set their own laws when they were codified into the DO. All right, let's start talking about some of these wine regions. What time? We're doing okay on time. We've only got 17 autonomous regions and a couple hundred DOs to cover, guys. But we'll go pretty quickly, I think, through some of this because, as we know, there's so much to discuss. And this is just an overview. I really hope for those of you that aren't familiar with Spain but are looking to become familiar, that this will just be a foundation for you to go ahead and build upon. I actually found something kind of fun. And so I know there's several of us here that have been to a lot of these virtual classes since we started doing them, and you already know me and my kind of study and teaching style. But I pulled this out. This is from like 2016, 2017, when I was first trying to understand Spain. And I was like, wow, look at this country and all of these regions and what happened where. And I started just taking these maps and making these notes. And I would go over these maps and I would essentially be like, okay, well, here's, Jumilla, and I would like draw a line and I would write everything that I knew that I could remember about Jumilla, right? What the grape varieties were, if you have to make the wines a specific way, and so forth. So I don't know, I just thought this was kind of neat. This is one of the ways that I find it best to study, is just taking maps and writing on them for the context. So, maybe that could be helpful for somebody else. I'm not sure. So we're talking about Galicia. Galicia is a kind of an anomaly in the topographical and climatic ideas that we have about Spain. It is called green Spain because it is cold, it is wet, it has very verdant vegetation. There's a lot of rivers here, there's a lot of rainfall in this corner. You can kind of see you have this curve in the coastline, so you have this Atlantic influence on all different sides. We have a lot of granite soils, and really cool maritime climate influence. It's also a very old established region. You might be looking at this city right up here, Santiago de Compostela, and you might be recognizing that as a destination of pilgrimage for many people that were walking the Camino de Santiago, which is a religious walk that was oftentimes a pilgrimage for people coming to this city. So Rías Baixas is the main DO, the denomination de origin of the region. Over 90% of the vineyards are dedicated to the white grape Albarino. If you ever drink Vinho Verde or Alvarinho coming from Portugal, you are almost drinking the same wine. This is the Minho River, and right across the river is the region of Vinho Verde. So there's a little bit of a different tradition around how the wines are made, but they are the same grape, just known by the two names of their different languages. You also do see some really fun reds that come out of the region of Galicia. These are kind of salty, high acid red wines. They're not big and bold. They're light and fresh. They're known as red wines of the sea. They're typically made from a blend or single variety of grapes like Caíño, Escudero, or Mencía. Mencía is a grape that you find repeated quite often throughout green Spain and into other places in Spain as well, like Bierzo. There are 5 subzones in Rías Baixas, and the producer can choose to label with the subzone if the grapes do all come from these areas. So the most classic subzone is Valdesanas, which is here right on the coast. These tend to be for, especially for Albarino, the crispest, saltiest wines. These are the best example of the Albarino wine that you can have from Rías Baixas. Like these would be the most common that you would probably see in something like a blind tasting. Ribera da Ulla, you see a little bit more red grape coming from here. O Rosal and Condado de Té, these are a little bit like fruitier, bolder styles of Albarino. They're not as lean, they're not as salty, they're a little bit weightier and slightly fruitier because of that sort of slightly warmer climate as we move just a little bit south here. This kind of orangish area is Ribera, a very, again, historically significant region. A lot of the terraces that are here were established initially by Romans as well. So we're really along, especially like O Rosal, Condado de Té, Ribera Sacra, Valdeorras, Ribeiro. You can see that we're along a lot of the river tributaries. So many of these vineyards are built on these very steep slopes that do sit above the river themselves. The whites are based on a grape called Treixadura, which you'll also see in Rías Baixas, or Palomino, which is, yes, the sherry grape. The reds are typically based on the Caíño grape. Ribera Sacra, we move further in, the sort of crescent-shaped green area. This is the sacred riverbank. Romans were here building terraces as well. The main red grape that you see in this region is Mencia. And then in Valdeorras, you'll see Mencia as well, but you also see the white grape Godello. So Valdeorras is bordering over here Bierzo. So you had your first white wine today coming from the region of Bierzo, which tend to be a little bit slightly fuller and richer, Godello from Bierzo, than Godello from Valdeorras. Valdeorras essentially means like a valley of the gold, essentially. So Rías Baixas, you can really see here that because of the cooler, wetter climate, you have to elevate the grapes and plant them in this sort of pergola style, which allows for more airflow, so that we have less instances of rot on the grapes and the skins themselves. And you see these very steep terraces just build up right to the river in Ribera Sacra, sacred riverbank. As we move a little bit further north, we're coming into green Spain. So this is an area known as Stefan, the Bierzo, our class wine from this region. Yes, it is Bierzo. And thank you. Somebody also put Granada in there. That was the name. It's so funny. I've like been to Granada and I just could not remember the name of the city. But sometimes that happens. So, you know, sometimes you need something in a moment and it just doesn't come to you. So País Vasco. So we're in Basque country. We're closer to we're on the kind of the northern coast of Spain here. Areas like San Sebastian are closer to this area of Spain, near the Bay of Biscay. A lot of suffering, I would say, in this region, especially under Franco. The Basque were really, were really stripped of their kind of local identity and culture within this region. In the 1980s, we have an association that created to resuscitate the wine production from the native grapes of the region. A lot of the vineyards here were devastated during the reign and the regime of Franco. There are 3 DOs, Guettariaco, Chocolina, Vizcaico Chocolina, and Arabaco Chocolina. The Basque language is said to be unlike any other language on earth. It is one of the most unique and unknown where it really originated languages. I've heard somebody say one time that the closest language is Hungarian, but then I've heard other people say that that's not true at all. So I don't know which one is the truth, but it is a very unique language. The Basque people have been in this area of Europe for a very, very, very long time, thousands of years. So we make, in these three areas, we make white, rosé, and red from the local grapes. So the white is called Andarabi Zuri, the red is called Andarabi Belza. Again, right on the coast, imagine that these are crisp, fresh wines that you want to drink in warm weather in Bilbao, in San Sebastian, as you're on vacation, and with all of the local bounty and seafood that would come from the area. This is an area well known for pinchos, so kind of like small tapas that you would have out and about around the cities. And that would include things like padron peppers, kind of a smaller version of a shishito. This includes a lot of seafood, oysters, clams, shellfish, barnacles, and so forth. A lot of this that you would find here. So you can imagine that the whites and rosés are really kind of lean, and they're salty and they're crisp. They're very lemony, almost like squeezing citrus over your seafood, your bounty of the sea that you're getting from this area. Oftentimes the wines have a slight effervescence to them. This is because the wines were traditionally bottled very young and very soon after the fermentation. And sometimes they would retain a little bit of that spritz and that carbonation that occurred because of the fermentation. And it got trapped into the bottle once it was sealed. Usually we'll drink this as a young wine with oily seafood, and even the reds will be a little bit on the linear side. You might also see a lot of cider in this area if you go, especially in Asturias or Cantabria, which is Asturias and Cantabria is that area between País Vasco and the area that we were just talking about over here, Galicia, right, with like Rías Baixas and Ribera, Sacra, and so forth. So this is Asturias and Cantabria. A lot of kind of traditional Basque cider. It tends to be like very dry, a little funky. Usually it's poured out of one of these, which helps actually bring, I think, a little bit more of that effervescence to the wine. It's a traditional way. You would usually put it in your bottle. You would start to pour close to the cup, and then you would draw it away as you were pouring. I should have opened something, so I could have done that, like draw it away as you're pouring into the cup. So that's a traditional way of pouring both Basque wine and also Basque cider. And you can see all these like conservas, like pinchos, small tapas. This is one of my favorite ways to just dine out in Europe. Is like oftentimes you'll just walk into a place, have a glass of wine. They have all these small bites sitting out. You can just select what you like, have it with your glass of wine, and then be on your way to the next place. So let's get into red wine country. Are there only red wine produced in Rioja? No, of course not. We're in the middle of Spain, middle north area of Spain. Really long history of production here. The Cistercian monks were also in this area when they came over from the Pyrenees from France. One of the things that they were really renowned for was their aptitude for farming. So that includes both viticulture, farming grapes, and other types of crops as well. Decrees protecting the identity and the style of Rioja wine began as early as the 1700s. The style did begin to shift with French influence. There's a really famous winemaker in Spain. His name is Telmo Rodriguez. He has a brand in Rioja called Lanzaga. And sometimes he says that the traditional style of Rioja is not with oak. The traditional style of Rioja is pre the French influence. But I think most of us know the kind of modern style of Rioja as being made with either French or American oak barrels. It was the first DOCA in 1991. It is synonymous with quality Spanish wine. This is the region that people think of when they think of quality. So Tempranillo is the main red grape, although you also see Garnacha, Mezuelo, Graciana. You can have Rioja that's 100% of any of these grape varieties. There's no minimum requirement in Rioja for the grape varieties themselves, as long as you're using one or any combination of these grapes that you see. For the white, that would be Viura, Malvasia, Garnacha Blanca. You can have some Chardonnay and some Sauvignon Blanc too, a little bit of international grape varieties here. There are 3 subregions. Alta is the most classic region. We have more calcareous clay soils Most of the traditional estates, which you can see here, are based around the city of Harrow. This is considered the kind of like the top tier subregion of Rioja for Rioja, right? Alavesa, the smallest, the most northern. The styles coming from here, they are slightly closer to the coast. So we're just a little bit south of País Vasco here. They tend to be lighter, fresher wines. Oftentimes they don't see as much aging. They don't see as much time in oak. Sometimes they don't see oak at all. They're more of a joven or a young, fresh style. You might see wines that employ some carbonic maceration, almost like the wines coming from Beaujolais made from Gamay. And then you have Rioja Oriental, which was rebranded a few years ago. Baja means lower. They wanted to rename it Oriental at the eastern part of Rioja because they were afraid that consumers associated the term Baja, meaning lower Rioja, with lower quality wine. So it had been rebranded fairly recently within the last, I want to say like 3 or 4 years that's happened now. I mean, like I said, now I'm going on my first international trip in 3 years, and that just seems crazy. So I guess this probably happened even prior to that. Many Rioja wines do blend all three subzones. The traditional style is really made with used American oak barrels. This is because of that long transcontinental history of trade between Spain and the New World that was opened up with Isabel and Ferdinand and Christopher Columbus. They have their own traditional style of sparkling wine. You can produce cava within Rioja, but they also have their own appellation for sparkling wine called Vino Espumoso de Calidad de Rioja. This is a newer appellation. We're not seeing a lot of it, and maybe that's just because a lot of it's not being imported yet. But I think most consumers are familiar with the traditional cava name as opposed to the new Rioja sparkling wine name. They can't call it cava because they're calling it this, right? I think even some producers make both styles. And now we're also starting to see, like some of the other regions in Spain, a focus on single vineyard, single municipalities, like single town where all the grapes are associated with one town, or single zone. So you see the zone one a lot. You see a lot of wines that come from like Rioja Alta, it will say on the bottle. So that is a traditional zone. All of the grapes come from that sub-region. If it's a municipio, all of the grapes come from that village. If it's a single vineyard, of course, all of the grapes come from a single vineyard. And this always requires as well lower yield, more restrictive winemaking, and higher quality. So the more information you see on a label regarding where the grapes come from, usually the stricter the laws are regarding winemaking too. I'm sorry, I'm trying to go fast. We have so much to cover. Here we have a list of one of our favorite, what we really call traditional producers, Lopez de Heredia. They're known for aging their wines far past the minimum requirements for aging in Rioja, which we're about to discuss. The white wines just alone spend a minimum of 6 years aging at the property before they're ever released. They have their own cooper on site who repairs barrels because they have caverns and caverns of wine aging on the property because the wine just aged for such a long period of time. All right, Castilla y León. So first we're going to talk about Ribera del Duero. We're drinking the Condado de Haza. That is the other label that's owned by the same family, the Fernandez family. So we're a little bit southwest of Rioja. It is a warmer climate. We're more on that plateau, the Meseta, really, really high elevation, like something around like more than 2,000 feet in elevation. It's a relatively new wine region by comparison to the more established areas, especially for the quality of the region. It gained DO status in 1982. One of the reasons that it gained it as early as it did was really because of the work of Alejandro Fernandez and producers like Peter Sisek, and because of the established estate of Vega Sicilia. So Vega Sicilia is the flagship estate. It was founded in 1864. Vega Sicilia wines are very pricey. They're one of the most expensive wines in Spain. In 1929, they had new owners, and the winemaker achieved international acclaim at the Barcelona World Fair with the 1917 and 1918 vintages of Unico. They were the only major commercial producer in the region until Pesquera came in the 1970s. So really important history that we have here. So since the 1970s, we've seen a huge increase in the number of producers in this area. There's one Spanish master wine, his name is Pedro Ballesteros, and he spends a lot of time focusing on the region of Ribera del Duero, and especially with a lot of the kind of younger, more up-and-coming producers, not the really established ones. So established cult producers like Dominio de Pingas, I mentioned Peter Sisek, Alto. The version of Tempranillo that we find in Ribera del Duero has a thicker skin. So Tempranillo comes from temprano, it means early, it's an early ripening grape. It's called Tinta del País and Tinto Fino more locally. These wines can be blended with Garnacha, Malbec, Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, and the local white grape Albillo, but that's not as common, especially for these more established and quality-minded brands. Their focus is really Tempranillo, Tempranillo, Tempranillo. It would be more common to probably see the wines coming from this region aged in newer oak or in French oak as well. Just last year, the DO, so for a long time, the DO was only for red wines coming from the region. So if you were to make a white or rosé, you could never label it as Ribera del Duero, but they expanded the laws. Remember I said lots of changes. They expanded the law just last year, the year before, to allow rosés and whites from Albillo Mayor. So Albillo Mayor has always been the major white grape of Ribera del Duero. You just could never ever say it was coming from Ribera del Duero. So now you're going to start seeing more of those wines sold under the Ribera del Duero DO as well. Now, what are these aging requirements we keep talking about? Spain has a long history of aging wines at the property. If you like the flavor that change that take place with wine as it ages in either oak or in the bottle, less overt fruity notes, more dried fruit, more earth, sometimes more spice, a mushroomy, leathery note to the wine, you probably like Spanish red wine because they're oftentimes, aged. So what makes it different? Rioja and Ribera del Duero have longer aging requirements than the rest of Spain generally does. And so I would like to say, rather than, certainly, yes, you can memorize that the Crianza red that you have tonight coming from Condado de Haza, minimum of 2 years aging is required with a minimum of 1 year in oak. In Rioja, it does have to be aged in 225 liter oak barrels. That is the requirement, but there's no requirement to whether it's French or American oak. That's up to the discretion of the producer. There are many producers like Muga, who commonly will age their wine in both French and American and blend them together. There are producers like Remoluri who will have some wines labeled that age only in American and some labeled that age only in French oak. So it's really at the discretion of the producer themselves. But what I like to think about is more to understand Crianza Reserva and Gran Reserva, right? What we really want to consider is instead of always memorizing exactly what the aging requirement is, understanding what you would expect out of a wine of that stature or that classification, right? So Gran Reserva will always be more developed. It should have more age to it. It has to by law of how long it has to be aged than a Crianza, right? So Crianza wine will still exhibit these kind of fresh, bright red fruit characteristics. And then the Gran Reserva wine will be more like leather, dried fruit, strawberry fruit leather, take on more of the pioneer of oak, even when it's used. So you might get a little bit of that American oak flavor, kind of like coconut and dill, like pickling spices. And if you don't believe me, sometimes you pick up a Rioja wine and you're like, this smells a little bit like sunblock. It's kind of like coconutty, like sunscreen aroma to it as well. There are other aging terms that are allowed in Spain. We don't see these as often, Noble, Anejo, and Viejo. These also are not just a indication to how long the wines are aged, but also that the vessel that they are aged in. How are we doing on time? We're getting there. All right. So Castilla y Leon, land of the castles. This is I think Castilla y Leon has, dozens and dozens of UNESCO World Heritage Sites because of all of the castles that are in this region. And I'm sure some of you have been to Spain, and I remember the first time I went, especially traveling through the south of Spain, I was just like on the bus and I'm just like, every town you come to, there's a castle. I'm like, gosh, this is so cool. Like you never had seen anything like that before. So it's like, really is Spain in general, it's the land of the castle, but especially Castilla y Leon. We're in the northern part of the Meseta Central. We have a much more continental climate. The Duero River does flow westward through the center, and many of the wine regions of Castilla y Leon are centered on or near it. So we spoke of Ribera del Duero already. Arlanza is a really cool DO that's just north of Ribera del Duero. The climate is even more extreme here, but also Tempranillo-based wines. So if you like Rioja, if you like Ribera del Duero, you'll probably like Arlanza. Cigales is known for rosé wines, a very traditional style of rosé wine, coming from mostly Tempranillo, but also Grenache. Rueda, this is the kind of like crisp, fresh, hip white wine region in Spain in the 1980s. A lot of producers from Rioja and Ribera del Duero invested in white wine coming from Rueda. They focused primarily on Sauvignon Blanc and Godello, which is another crisp, fresh grape that makes this sort of green tint or scented flavored wine, a little bit more on the green fruited side, along with more herbaceous notes. Márquez de Riscal, traditional Rioja producer, was really the first to invest in this region, in the white wines of the region. And prior to the 1970s, 1980s, we really had a classic style of Spanish white wine that was certainly oxidative, more like what you would see coming from still today, traditionally from somewhere like Rioja. They just didn't have, like 1975, right, was when Franco died. This was the last dictatorship to fall in Western Europe. So the country, especially for wine and for investment, production, upkeep and maintenance, was really, really cut off. So you didn't really have, they didn't have stainless steel and temperature controlled fermentation prior really to like 1986. So it really wasn't until the 1980s that producers could actually make a style of white wine that would be like something like Sauvignon Blanc, that would be crisp, that would be fresh. You can see both red and rosé wine, sparkling Dorado, just style of a fortified style of wine coming from places outside of sherry. We have the Toro Dio, minimum 75%, Tinta del Toro. What is Tinta del Toro? Well, it's just another name for Tempranillo. Many of the appellations, the Dios within Castilla y Leon, do have their own moniker for the Tempranillo grape. It's hotter, it's drier. The Tempranillo here is fruitier and bolder. There are several estates from Ribera del Duero that also have houses in Toro Dio, including Vega Sicilia, and then Bierzo. So Bierzo is sort of situated. Arribas is a really interesting area too, with like Rufete and a lot of other indigenous Spanish grape varieties. You don't see a lot of wine coming from these regions, but if you find them, it's right on the border of Portugal. Give them a try. They're not as like bold as Tempranillo. They tend to be a little bit on the lighter, fresher side. There's a couple of natural producers over there, so they can be a little funky, but they're fun wine and they're usually really inexpensive. I would say under $20 a bottle. Bierzo, just across the border from Valdeorras. We also see Mencía and Godello for the red and white wine. It's slightly warmer than we see in Valdeorras, so there will be a little bit of bigger, bolder style to both Godello and Mencía. So Bierzo as well, we're just running out of time. I'm so sorry. They also recently adopted a classification system based on the Burgundian model. So as we kind of saw with the Bierzo wine that we had, the Paraje, they also are classifying their wines, oftentimes, especially, so Descendiente de Jose Palacios. This is a project by Alvaro Palacios and his nephew, and they're two of the biggest proponents of this classification system that does now exist within Bierzo. So village, regional, village, and single vineyard wines, and you can see all of those things on the label of these wines as well. Okay. Catalunya, here we are. Now we're in Paneles, on the coast. This is Barcelona, the home of, the Ramblas, the home of Antonio Gaudi. If you've been to Barcelona, of course, the Sagrada Familia, Park Güell, right? All of these wonderful monuments to architecture in the city of Barcelona. It's a really beautiful place. It is sort of the heartland of industry and wealth and modernization in Spain as well. It's the birthplace of sparkling traditional method wine, cava. It is the birthplace of the gyro palette, something that we use to produce cava wines. And we do have an upcoming cava masterclass that will be taught by Laura. So maybe we'll save a little bit of the instruction on cava production for that class. I think it should be really fun. I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end. But we see more stainless steel winemaking. Miguel Torres is a really important producer within this area. Josep Reventos introduced the Metodo Tradicional, Metodo Clásico style in 1872 to the region after visiting Champagne. So cava is a DO, a denomination de origin. The only difference is that it covers a style and not a region. So as long as certain areas are authorized to produce cava in Spain, cava can be produced anywhere, but 95% of cava does come from this region in Paneles. So tradition is to use the local white grapes of the region, Macabeo, Periada, and Xarel·lo. You can also use Malvasia and Chardonnay for the whites. For rosé cava, it's authorized to use Oliva, which is Tempranillo, Garnacha, Monastrell, Pinot Noir, and Trapat for rosé wines. There are 3 distinct altitude zones. Again, classifying the terroir, which you might see on the label as well. The minimum time for aging cava wines is 9 months, much like Cremant you find in France outside of Champagne. 18 months for Reserva wines, 30 months for Gran Reserva, and 36 months for the Cava de Paraje Calificado wines, which is a newer level of quality cava production from single vineyards. Paraje, see that word like we have on your white wine, right? From single municipality or a single vineyard, depending on what it is, like a little. I'd have to go back and look that up again, with a longer minimum aging requirement. And I think too, it's a lot of these are starting to build into the DO and into the laws, rules regarding organic grapes too, like using organic vineyards, older vines, there's restrictions on the age of the vine. They have to be above a certain age in order to use them. And we see that in Priorat too, as we're moving on. So we're still in Catalunya. We're southwest of Paneles. We are in a higher elevation zone. We're set a little bit further away from the coast. It takes its name from the Priorato de Scala, a monastery that was founded on the site of a boy's vision of angels ascending into heaven. After post-World War II, and during the reign of Franco, a lot of the smaller villages, much of like what happened in Italy too, declined in their population as a lot of the workforce, especially the younger workforce, moved closer to cities looking for work. And in many of these areas, if they were traditional for grape growing and winemaking, these vineyards were abandoned. In 1979, René Barbier, who was originally from Gigondas in France, worked as a winemaker for Alvaro Palacios. This is one of the most important names that you find in Spanish wine of Clos Mogador. They planted a mix of local and French grapes in Gratelopes, which is a village within Priorat, and put the region on the map for the first time. In 1989, a group of winemakers cooperatively in the same cellar produced a single red wine, but they each bottled it under their own label. So it was bottled under 5 different labels: René Barbier, Clos Mogador, Palacios Clos Dauphin, Clos Erasmus, Clos de Labac, and Clos Martinet. So these are still, especially Martinet, Clos Dauphin, and Clos Mogador are all still really, really important wineries in the Priorat area. So this really brought about a revolution. These are high altitude vineyards with intensely low yield. The vines have to dig into this Icorea soil, this kind of like schist and slate soil that you have in the vineyards here, to dig down deep enough to establish themselves. The yields are almost negligible. They are very, very small. So Grand Cru Burgundy, maximum yield is 35 hectoliters per hectare. In Priorat, just for what the vine can actually give, we're talking about like 10, 12 hectoliters per hectare. And that's one of the reasons that these wines are so bold. Because of their higher elevation and proximity to the sun, they also develop thicker skin. And so you really get these like tannic, bold, full flavored wines coming from this region. Sometimes they are blended with, primarily they're based on Garnacha, but they can be blended with some international grape varieties as well. The main 2 red grapes of the region are Garnacha and Carignan. They call it Samso in the region, or Mazuelo. You see it's called it like Mazuelo and Rioja. This is why Spain has over 625 grape varieties, right? Is it 625 or is it 300 grape varieties? And 300 grape varieties that are all Tempranillo, and then another 325. Because they are really, depending on the region, that kind of like local pride, that autonomy that each of these regions have, they do tend to have their own name for these grape varieties. It's very small production, but you will see Garnacha Blanca, or white wine from Garnacha Blanca, Macabeo, Pedro Jimenez, Chenin, and Moscatel. And then in 2009, we established Vina de Pueblo. So this is 12 villages of production within Rioja. You can label the wines by the village itself. And in 2019, we established the DOQ Priorat Vineyard classification. Burgundy inspired 5 classification levels. Grapes can come from anywhere and be called DOQ Priorat. Grapes can come from 1 of 12 villages and be labeled as a village wine. Grapes can come from 1 of the 459 parajes, which is essentially like a single area, not necessarily a single vineyard, but almost more like a lieu-dit, or something like you would compare that to in France. You have the Viña Clasificada. This belonged to Clos Mogador, Mas de Rosa, Coma Blanca, and Clos Fanta. And then at the very top single vineyard, you have 1 essentially Grand Cru vineyard. The only one that exists is Alvaro Palacios Lermita. So we will see these vineyard classifications start to come regional, lieu-dit, regional village, lieu-dit, vineyard, Grand Cru vineyard classification coming on these bottles of Priorat wine. Outside of Priorat in Catalonia, you have Montsant. This is a region also known for Garnacha Carignana. Sometimes we say it's kind of like a poor man's Priorat. The wines are made the same way. Montsant is the ring that kind of goes around the Priorat region. They do tend to be a little bit lighter, lower elevation. The wines aren't quite as intense. You have Tarragona DO, traditionally for Mistela wine, but today we see a lot of white grape for Cava as well. Alea is a really cool DO for still dry Xarel-lo, not being used to make Cava. Producers like Enric Soler, Mascandi are doing really great things with just this Xarel-lo grape on its own, making really interesting textured, kind of limey and green fruit flavored wine. They tend to be a little bit more like herbal and fennelly as well. Really fun. And this region Empora too, making really fantastic Carignana Carignan rosés, but also focusing a lot on Grenache these days too. All right, we're gonna wrap it up soon. I knew we'd go over. Are you guys still with me? Wow, you are wonderful. Thank you for being with us tonight. I know we have a lot to cover. So Castilla-La Mancha, this is the largest demarcated wine region in all of Europe. It is hot, it is dry, it is the home of Don Quixote, windmills. They have Sensibel, which is Tempranillo, and the white grape Arin. Arin for a very long time was the world's most planted grape. It has been overtaken, but this is because a lot of the production actually goes into Spanish brandy. So they grow a lot of the Arin white grape that is then made into a wine and fortified into a spirit, or not fortified, distilled into a spirit as brandy. And they use that. What do you think they use that brandy for? Well, a lot of people use it to fortify sherry in the South. La Mancha, you know, we mentioned a huge portion of this is distilled into brandy. Mentrida Dio, this is the site of the very first Vino de Pago that we really saw. So we have Valdepusa and Finca Alez, established in 2003. They really have a kind of a unfortunately poor reputation that really is increasing. And it's increasing because of its proximity to the Sierra de Gredos, which is a very up and coming region for Grenache or Garnacha as well. If you like Grenache, check out Mentrida, check out the Sierra de Gredos. Manchuela, we see Bobal. Bobal can kind of tend to be like a lighter, juicier Malbec, but like not quite as rich, not quite as heavy, not usually oaked, kind of light, fresh, juicy, maybe almost a little bit like maybe I would say almost like Beaujolais-esque in a way too, with a little bit more dark fruit to it. If you ever see Garnacha Tintorera, this is not Grenache or Garnacha. It is its own Teinturier grape. It's also known as Alicante Boucher. But you're seeing some really cool wines coming from Almanza, especially from Invinite, that are these really kind of fruit forward but bold but really delicious wines. And then Valdepeñas tends to be the best area for Sensibel or Tempranillo that we see within the region. Now Madrid, as I mentioned, the Sierra de Gredos, so really seeing some of Spain's best Grenache, the Comando G, Four Monos. This is the Invinite. This is the Garnacha Tintorera that I mentioned coming out of Almanza, and even things like Grenache Blanc from Bernalebos. Some really, really great wines. I'm actually going to the Sierra de Gredos when I go to Spain in October, so I will report back. I'm going to Ribera del Duero, Madrid, and the Sierra de Gredos. So expect notes when I return. On the coast, we have the Levant, the eastern coast of Spain, Valencia, Utiel Requena, and Alicante. Alicante, I always like to mention Fondion, a Solera-style oxidative dessert wine made from overripe but not fortified Monistel grapes that is aged for a minimum of 10 years. A really unique style of non-fortified sweet wine coming from Spain. I don't think there's really anything quite like it anywhere else. In Murcia, we have more of a desert-like climate. Really, so these areas, Murcia, Yecla, Jumilla, and Bulas, are really fantastic for the Monastrell grape. So Monastrell is the same grape that you see in the south of France, called Mourvedre. It actually originated just like Garnacha, Grenache, Carignan, right? Monastrell, Mourvedre. So those are all the French names and Spanish names for each of those three grapes. They're all traditionally Spanish. So somebody brought them over the border of the Pyrenees, planted them in the south of France, and we think of them so much more often as the wines for like Chateauneuf de Pape, Côte-du-Rhône, Gigondas, and so forth, right? So Andalusia, we're in Jerez. We have a really great recording of a sherry class, because I'm going to skip over this so quickly. If anybody does want a copy of that, just let me know. We've got so many fun things out there. So that we're at the southern tip of Spain. There are 3 main towns at the center of production where cherry must be made and aged. So Sanlúcar de Barrameda, Jerez de la Frontera, and El Puerto de Santa Maria. Depending on where your bodega is and where the wines are aging, all 3 of these villages can produce its own style of sherry. So like Sanlúcar de Barrameda, closer to the sea, it's the coolest. The layer of floor that grows on the wine, the yeast is the most constant year round, and it creates these really like minerally, like salty, white wines. We also have in El Puerto de Santa Maria, with further south, the wines are a little bit bolder. I heard César Saldana, the president of the Sherry Consejo Regulador, who we're doing a dinner with him at Cork Buzz in October. So we'd love to see some of you there if you're around in the city. He said that sometimes the El Puerto de Santa Maria, and one of the things that he says about the sherry is they have this almost like kind of like low tide character to them, and he means it in a really, really good way. That's like more like briny, sort of like seaweedy, like spirulina character to the wines. And I thought it was a really cool description of how we describe that. So most of the soils are alberita. These are the most important soil type. They're water-retaining chalk soils. The grape is Palomino. This is 95% of all the wines are made from Palomino. It's a white grape. Most of the styles are made from this. There is a small percentage of other grapes, Moscatel and Pedro Jimenez, that are planted as well. That floor is that film of yeast that does grow on top of the wines as well. And once we pick our Palomino grapes, we decide what type of sherry we're going to make from them. So Fino is a style of sherry that's always aged under that kind of like that yeast that grows on top of the wine. This protects Fino and Manzanilla sherries from oxidation. So they're very like more like fresh dough, salty, chamomile, fresh fruit style of sherry wine. Amontillado is aged first as a Fino, and then it's an Oloroso. So what that means is it ages under the layer of floor, and then the wine is fortified to a higher ABV. It kills off that layer of floor, and it continues to age as an oxidative style, like an Oloroso. An Oloroso is always aged as an oxidative style. So where Finos are protected by floor and will be, again, that kind of like light Marcona almond, olive, chamomile flower, briny character. Oloroso wines, even though they are dry, have a richer texture and flavor, higher alcohol, and they're more like candied nuts and orange peel and maple and toffee. Now, these are flavors that we associate with sweet things, but these sherries are not sweet. These are dry style. They're not cream or sweet sherries. So Fino, Amontillado, Oloroso, Palo Cortado, when you see these styles of sherry, they will be dry. They're all coming from the Palomino grape. And then the Fino, light, fresh, salty, zippy, aged under floor. Oloroso, nutty, oxidative, sweet smelling, but not sweet tasting. And then Amontillado and Palo Cortado are right in between. They start their life as a Fino and finish their life as an Oloroso, and they have some of the characteristics of both. Now, we can only draw off so much sherry to be bottled every year, about a third of the amount of wine that's in, this is called the Solera. And so essentially, because the wine do age for a minimum of 2 years, but most producers age sherry wines much longer, you have to continuously refresh the nutrients with new wine. And so there's the bottom criadera called the Solera is always the oldest wine that's what's bottled. And then this row is replaced with the previous row, replaced with the previous row, replaced with the previous, replaced with the new vintages wine. I hope I described that well. I apologize if we didn't there. Canary Islands. If you like smoky wines that have intense minerality to them, you will like the Canary Island wines. A wonderful history in the Canary Islands. The grape Listón Prieto is known in the New World in places like Chile as País, Criolla Chica in Argentina, and as the mission grape in California and Mexico. this was one of the last stops for a lot of Spanish ships that were heading to the New World. So they would stop in the Canary Islands, they would fuel up on wine, grapes, and food before continuing their trip across the Atlantic. There are a number of islands, and we do grow wine on most of them, but not all. Lanzarote is a crazy looking island that barely grows anything but grapevine. These wines have a beautiful ashy minerality to them. Most of the wines for white are coming from the Malvasia grape, although you might see some of the other white grape, which is Listan Blanco. You also might see red or rosé wines coming from the Listan Negro grape variety, which is considered to be the kind of the higher quality of the Listan Prieto of those two reds that are on the area. The main island is Tenerife, divided into several different DOs on the island. And then each of the other islands do have essentially its own island DO. You can also declassify to just Islas Canarias. This is the Lanzarote, the vine that we're just telling you about how they grow. They have to grow this way to be protected from both the wind and also to absorb any moisture that the wind is picking up from the ocean. So essentially this sort of acts like a funnel. This is volcanic soil, it's pumice, so it's really water retentive. So essentially the soil almost like grabs any moisture that's in the air as it's blowing over the island. And as it grabs that moisture, because these vines are planted in holes, essentially those few drops of precious moisture will water the vine. Again, very, very low yields here. And then these barriers sort of help protect the vine from the winds that are really quite fierce on the area as well. Mallorca is another great place for wine production, a range of international and indigenous grapes. If you do look for those indigenous grapes, look for Manta Negra and Mole or Prensal Blanc on the island. You see a lot more wine coming from the Canary Islands, I think, today in the past several years, but I don't think you see as many from Mallorca. But both of them are really traditionally known for a very big tourism wine trade, meaning there's a lot of tourists that go to both Mallorca, the Balearic Islands, and also the Canary Islands, and a lot of the wine is consumed locally by tourism in the area, which is pretty cool. Oh my gosh, thank you so much. We have a lot of pride, of course, very fierce local pride, a lot of traditions in each of these areas, languages like the Basque language, food and wine across the country, a love of food, great culinary tradition. Well, I think the cuisine is amazing, and you know, I haven't been to Spain in probably like 4 years. But I think when I was there, you know, great food is a basic right in Spain. It is accessible, it is affordable. You can go out and have a dinner at a Michelin-starred restaurant, you know, for like €100. Like, it's really hard to do something like that in the US, and especially somewhere like New York City. Always keep in mind, of course, what grows together goes together. So if you're having fresh coastal white wine, definitely start thinking about having that coastal white wine with a lot of seafood, right? And vice versa. If you're more inland in Rioja, you have that bolder red wine, you're thinking about lamb, you're thinking about steaks, you're thinking about like merguez, of course, you're thinking about sausages like chorizo. Also, feel comfortable with this aging classification in Spain. You know, consider pairing aged wines with aged meats and cheeses. You know, have that aged Rioja with an aged goat cheese, an aged manchego or sheep milk cheese. So I think there's a lot of really fun pairings that can happen. I'm so sorry to keep you over. I really wanted to be on time. Maybe we just gave us a little too much to go over today. But you know, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you can see why we are so passionate about Spanish wine. There are some great places in New York City that you can find Spanish wine aside from Pork Buzz, both retail and restaurants. So I'll make sure to send out a list of those areas tomorrow as well. Thank you, everybody. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I'll send out a follow-up tomorrow. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. We have a bunch of really cool, exciting Spanish cava and Sherry like walk around tastings and wine dinner coming up in September and October. And I'll make sure to send out information on those events tomorrow as well. Good night, everybody.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you. I'm so glad you enjoyed. We'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Good night.
everybody. Good night.
Bye-bye.